And section 7.2 is actually a pretty straightforward section. It is going to deal with multiplying polynomials. So last time we added and subtracted polynomials. This time we are going to multiply them. And there's a couple of simple rules that we're going to do when we multiply polynomials. But first we're going to look at binomials. So what happens when we try to multiply binomials? Alright, and here's the cool thing about this. The product of two polynomials or the product of two binomials is always a polynomial. And really the product of any two polynomials is always going to be a polynomial. Alright, and we're going to use a method of the distributive property. So remember, the distributive property is where you multiply a number outside of the parentheses to inside parentheses, everything on the inside of the parentheses. And so I'm going to give a couple of different examples here. I'm going to give what's called a horizontal method. I'm going to give what's called a vertical method. And now personally, I like the horizontal method better, so we're going to do that one first. Because the horizontal method is a lot more similar to the sort of thing that we'll be doing later in today's lesson. But I'm going to give a couple of binomials, the first one being x plus 2, and the second one being x plus 5. And we want to multiply x plus 2 multiplied by x plus 5. And we'll denote that by putting both of these in parentheses. And what we're going to do is we're going to break down this first binomial, this x plus 2, into an x and a 2. So we're going to put the x out here, we're going to put the 2 over here. And then in parentheses, we're going to put our x plus 5. So we're going to take our x and multiply it times an x plus a 5. And then we're going to take our 2 and multiply that by x plus 5 as well. So let me close this parentheses. And then what you do is whatever sign here is in between the x and the 2, you're going to put that same sign between it like so. Oops, backed up way too far there. So we're going to have an x multiplied by an x plus 5 and it plus a 2 multiplied by an x plus 5. So basically we just took this x and this 2 and multiplied it across. It's a version of the distributive property. And now we will take this x and multiply it by this x, and we're going to take the x and multiply it by the 5, and then we're going to take the 2 and multiply it by the x, and the 2 multiplied by the 5. And when we do that, we're going to get x squared plus 5x, because x times x is x squared, x times 5 is 5x. We're going to put our plus sign, it's going to come straight down. 2 multiplied by x is going to be 2x. And then 2 multiplied by 5 is going to be 10. And now we just need to finish this out by combining like terms. So that's going to be x squared plus a 5x plus a 2x is going to be a total of 7x's. And then we're going to end that out with a plus 10 at the end. Right. Another method that you can do, and this one I'm not as big of a fan of, but you might like it, is the vertical method. Now the vertical method is going to look a little different. It's going to be, let's multiply out x plus 3 multiplied by x minus 4. And so what you're going to do is you're going to write both of these two vertically. So we have an x plus a 3, and we're going to multiply that. So there's our multiply sign by x plus a 4. And now you would multiply like you're multiplying two large numbers. You know, like if you took like 112 multiplied by 16, and you multiplied everything by a 6 first, and then multiplied everything by a 1, and added them together. That's what you're going to be doing. So we're going to multiply everything on top by a 4. So we're going to multiply, that needs to be a minus 4. That's a mistake on my part. So we're going to multiply everything here by a minus 4. So that's going to be a minus 4 multiplied by x plus 3. And so minus 4 multiplied by x is a negative 4x. And a negative 4 multiplied by a positive 3 is going to be a negative 12. And then we're going to move on to the next row. And we're going to have this x, and we need to multiply the x by everything on top. So that's going to be an x here multiplied by an x plus 3. And so x times an x is going to be an x squared. And an x times a 3 is going to be a plus 3x. And now we will combine like terms by adding straight down again. So we have an x squared. Negative 4 plus 3 is going to be a negative 1x. And then our minus 12 is also going to come just straight down there. And so x plus 3 multiplied by x minus 4 is going to be x squared minus x minus 12. And so if you want to multiply things out like that, you can, but fortunately we have a bit of a shortcut. And that shortcut is going to be known as the FOIL method. So the FOIL method is a shortcut for multiplying two binomials. All right, and FOIL is actually an acronym. And so we're going to have an F, an O, an I, and an L. The F is going to stand for first terms. The O is going to stand for outside terms, or outer terms. The I is going to stand for inside terms. And the L is going to stand for last terms. So first, outer, inner, last is how I remember that. And so now we're going to use FOIL on a multiplication. So let's use FOIL. For x plus 1 multiplied by x plus 2. And to really hammer home FOIL again, I'm going to re-spell it out. So F, once again, is your first terms. O is going to be your outside terms. I is going to be your inside terms. And I know this probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense without seeing it visually yet, but I promise we'll get there shortly. And L is going to be your last term. All right, so now we're going to write this out. And what I mean by first term is I mean the first term in each polynomial. So the first term in x plus 1 is going to be an x plus a 1. And the first term in x plus 2 is going to be an x plus 2. So the first term there is written in x. All right, we can go down and finish this out. The outside terms, if you imagine this whole x plus 1 multiplied by x plus 2 is like a large polynomial, your outside term is going to be your furthest on the left and your furthest on the right. All right, so your furthest on the left is an x, and then you're going to have your plus 1. And then you're going to have an x, and your furthest on the right is going to be that plus 2. And I'm actually going to space this out just a little bit here. There we go. So we have plenty of room there. All right. Your inside terms now. So if your outside terms are the two that are on the furthest on the outside, our inside term is going to be our terms that are right next to each other in the parentheses. So that's going to be the 1 in the x plus 1, and that's going to be the x in the x plus 2. And then finally, move that guy down. Oops, what happened to it? There it goes. Finally, we're going to have our last term. So our first terms, right back up here, was the first one in each. Now we're going to do the last one in each. So that's going to be an x plus a 1 multiplied by an x plus a 2. So that's just highlighting where each one of these terms is. And as you're practicing these kinds of problems and you're going through these problems, you eventually turn this into a mental math type of deal. So now what you're going to do is you're going to just multiply the first terms. So just multiplying the first terms is going to result in an x multiplied by an x, which is going to equal x squared. Just multiplying your outside terms is going to result in an x multiplied by a 2, which is equal to 2x. Just multiplying your inside terms is going to result in a 1 multiplied by your x, or just an x. And then finally, we're going to round things off by doing our last terms, which is going to be a 1 multiplied by a 2, or just the number 2. So now these are the terms of our new polynomial, and all we need to do is add them together. So now let's combine all of these terms. So we're going to have here, if we originally had an x plus 1 multiplied by an x plus 2, that is going to equal each one of these terms added together. So we're going to have an x squared plus a 2x plus an x plus a 2. So each one of these terms that we just found, our first terms, our outside terms, our inside terms, and our last terms, we're just going to add them all together, and that is going to be our answer. So this is going to be equal to, well, x squared is by itself. A 2x plus an x is going to be equal to 3x, and we're going to have the 2 on the outside. And so now, the two binomials, x plus 1 multiplied by x plus 2, is going to equal x squared plus 3x plus 2. And that is the FOIL method. And now we can really hone this method home and practice it a lot more. We're going to do lots of practice examples today because this is really just the gist of the lesson. So let's do some more practice. We're going to multiply using FOIL. So our first one, A, is going to be x minus 3, and then an x minus a 6. And so if we take our x minus 3 multiplied by x minus 6, I'm going to keep the same color scheme. So F is going to be my first terms. The blue O is going to be my outside terms. The green I is going to be my inside terms. And then the purple L is going to be my last term. So we keep that same color scheme here going on. So our first term in each is an x to an x. And so that's going to be an x times an x, or our first terms. Right, and then we're going to put a plus sign. And then we're going to go to our outside terms. So that's going to be an x to a negative 6. So that's just an x multiplied by a negative 6. And then we're going to put a plus sign. All right, then our inside terms is going to be this negative 3 and this x. So that's going to be a negative 3 multiplied by x. Whatever sign is in front of the number, whether it's a negative or a positive, that sign goes with it. So both of these are negative. So that's why this negative and this negative exist right there. And then we're going to put a plus sign. And then we're going to do our last terms, which is a negative 3 multiplied by negative 6. Oops, and I forgot to fill in up here. So first, oops, then I write the wrong one. First, outer, inner, last. Notice that when we look at this over here, on top I have two arrows coming from our first term, right? Going to each of the terms. So I have an arrow going to the x, and I have an arrow going to the 6. And then below, I go to my next term, the negative 3, and I have an arrow going to the x, and I have an arrow going to the 6. All right, so that's how I like to visualize those problems. Each term in the second binomial gets multiplied by each term in the first binomial, or first, outer, inner, last, FOIL. And so now that's going to equal, well, x multiplied by an x is an x squared. X multiplied by a negative 6 is going to be a negative 6x. Right? So we can get rid of this plus sign here and just write a negative 6x, because this negative is going to turn that whole thing into a negative. Then a negative 3x, well, that's just a negative 3x. And then a negative 3 multiplied by a negative 6 is going to be a positive 18. And so now if we combine all our like terms, that's going to be an x squared minus a 6x minus a 3x is going to be a minus a 9x plus 18. Oops. Just draw a circle around it. There we go. You know what? No circle, nothing. We'll just leave it like this. There we go. All right, so we're going to do the same thing now. This second example is going to have a little twist to it, nothing too much. All we're going to do is add a 2 in front of our x. So we're going to have a 2x plus 1 multiplied by now a 3x minus 5. So the only difference between this first problem and the second problem is that now we have numbers in front of our x. It's not going to change the method. We're still going to go first, outer, inner, last. We're still going to use the FOIL method. All right, so starting with our first terms, we have a 2x multiplied by a 3x. And then we're going to add. Then we're going to take the 2x and multiply it by the negative 5. And then we're going to put a plus sign. Then we're going to go over to the 1 and multiply it by the 3x. That's going to be our inside terms. And then finally, we're going to take our 1 and multiply our last term. And that negative has to come with it, so that's going to be a negative 5. So now we just multiply these out and combine like terms. So a 2x minus or multiplied by a 3x is going to be 6x squared. Then a 2x minus a 5, or sorry, 2x multiplied by a negative 5 is going to be a negative 10x. Then 1 multiplied by 3x is just going to be a positive 3x. And then 1 multiplied by a negative 5 is going to be a negative 5. So then we just combine our like terms to get 6x squared. Negative 10x plus 3x is going to be a negative 7x. And then we're going to have our negative 5 here at the end. So that's the FOIL method. That is the whole purpose of today's lesson, is teaching that FOIL method. Now I have tons and tons and tons of examples if you want to do more examples. So I'm gonna do some more examples, especially if you're not able to catch this live and ask a question. So I got 4 more examples we're gonna do, and then we're gonna see what happens when we multiply a binomial and a trinomial. So 2 terms multiplied by 3 terms. So real quick, let's do some extra FOIL practice. Our first one is going to be m minus 3 multiplied by m minus 7. And so our first 2 terms is m to an m. Our outside 2 terms is an m and a negative 7. Our 2 inside terms is a negative 3 and an m. And our 2 last terms is going to be a negative 3 and a negative 7. And then we'll throw some plus signs in here. These plus signs are really just placeholders, because if it becomes a negative, then you're going to replace that with a subtraction sign. So now m multiplied by m is going to be an m squared. Negative 7 multiplied by m is going to be a negative 7m, so we can get rid of that plus sign there. Negative 3 multiplied by m is going to be a negative 3m. And negative 3 multiplied by negative 7 is going to be a positive 21. And so now this is going to equal m squared. A negative 7 multiplied by a negative 7m minus 3m's is going to be a negative 10m. And then we're going to have our 21 at the end. All right, let's do another example. Let's look at x minus 4 multiplied by x plus 2. All right, so we're going to go x to x for our first terms. Then we're going to go to our 2 outside terms. So that's an x and a 2. And then we're going to go to our 2 inside terms. And then we're going to go to our last terms. Notice that I'm bringing that negative here with that 4. All right, we'll throw some plus signs in here for placeholders once again. And so now an x multiplied by an x is going to be x squared. X multiplied by 2 is going to be a positive 2x. Negative 4 multiplied by x is going to be a negative 4x. And negative 4 multiplied by 2 is going to be a negative 8. And so now when we combine like terms, we're going to start with our x squared. A 2x minus a 4x is going to be a negative 2x, because 2 minus a 4 is negative 2. And then we're going to have our negative 8 here on the end. All right. Do another problem. This one is going to be a little tricky because it involves some fractions. So we're going to have a 2x plus 1/2 multiplied by x minus 3/2. All right, so we just stepped up our game, but we really aren't going to change anything. We're still going to use that FOIL method. So we're going to take our 2 first terms, that 2x and that x, multiply those together. We're going to take our 2 outside terms, multiply those together. So that's a 2x and a negative 3/2. Don't forget that negative sign. And then we're going to multiply our inside terms. So that's a 1/2 multiplied by an x. And then finally, we're going to multiply our last terms. So that's going to be a 1/2 multiplied by 3/2. We're going to throw our plus signs in there. And so now we're just going to multiply everything through. A 2x multiplied by an x is going to be a 2x squared. A 2x multiplied by a negative 3/2. So we need to replace this plus sign with a negative. The 2 is going to cancel with this 2, and all we're going to be left with is a negative 3x. Once again, the 2 on the bottom here is going to divide out this 2, and you're just going to be left with the x multiplied by negative 3. And then we're going to have a 1/2 x. That's pretty straightforward. And then we need to take 1/2 multiplied by 3/2. So 1 multiplied by 3 is 3. And 2 multiplied by 2 is 4. So that is 3/4. And then we combine our like terms to finish everything out. So that's going to be equal to 2x squared. And then a negative 3x plus a half is going to be negative 2.5x. And then plus 3/4 on the end. I think that's one of the more difficult problems you might see. Other than maybe 4 might trick you up a little bit. So 4 is going to be n plus 2 multiplied by n squared plus 3. So the only difference on this one is we have this squared here. But it's still a binomial multiplied by a binomial. So we can definitely use the FOIL method. So our n multiplied by our n squared is going to be our 2 first terms. Then once again, we're going to go to our 2 outside terms. So that's going to be an n plus a 3, or n multiplied by a 3. And then we're going to go to our 2 inside terms. So that's going to be a 2 multiplied by an n squared. And then we're going to go to our 2 last terms. So that's a 2 and a 3. And then we're going to put in our plus sign placeholders. Multiply those out, combine like terms, and be finished. So we're going to get n multiplied by n squared is going to be an n cubed. Then n multiplied by 3 is going to be 3n. 2 multiplied by n squared is just 2n squared. And then we're going to have this 6 on the end. All right. Notice there's no like terms here. There's nothing we can combine. But I'm going to switch the spot of the 3n and the 2n squared so we can write that in standard form. So that's going to be n cubed plus 2n squared plus 3n plus 6. All right, so those are a bunch of different problems and examples that you might see concerning foiling. That's the whole purpose of today's lesson. All right. Real quick before we get done with today's lesson, I want to look what happens when you multiply a binomial and a trinomial. All right, so what that's going to look like is an x plus a 5 multiplied by an x squared plus, an x squared minus a 3x minus a 2. And it's going to be the same concept as FOIL, except now you have to multiply that x through everything, and you have to multiply that plus 5 through everything. So we're going to first take a look at this x. Right, we'll write it down here, and that has to be multiplied by an x squared, and it has to be multiplied by a negative 3x, and it has to be multiplied by a negative 2. Right, we're going to put some plus signs in between there. So there's all our x terms. And then we're going to take this 5 and multiply it through on everything. So that's going to be a 5 multiplied by an x squared, a 5 multiplied by a negative 3x, and then a 5 multiplied by a negative 2. We're going to put our plus signs in there. And now we just multiply it out, combine like terms, and be good to go. So an x multiplied by an x squared is going to be an x cubed. A negative 3x multiplied by an x is going to be a negative 3x squared. An x multiplied by negative 2 is going to be a negative 2x. 5 multiplied by x squared is going to be a positive 5x squared. 5 multiplied by a negative 3x is going to be a negative 15x. And 5 multiplied by a negative 2 is going to be a negative 10. And now we have to go through and identify all our like terms. So first off, is there any more x cubes? No, 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 and no. So we're going to write our x cubed down here. Then we're going to go through and identify if there's any x squareds. Oh, there's another x squared right here. So now we have a negative 3x squared plus a 5x squared. A negative 3 plus a 5 is a positive 2x squared. All right, then is there any terms with just an x? Well, we got a negative 2x there and a negative 15x there. A negative 2 plus a negative 15 is a negative 17x. And then finally, we just have that negative 10 there at the end. So that's how you would multiply a binomial with a trinomial. All right, I'm going to do one more of these, and then I'm going to wrap it up. If you have any questions, now would be a great time to ask. I'll leave this right there so you can see it, but I will have to get rid of it in just a second. We're going to practice with x plus 1 multiplied by x squared plus a 5x plus an 8. All right, so we're going to identify our first term here being this x and multiply it through by everything up top there. All right, so we're going to take an x multiplied by an x squared, an x multiplied by a 5x, and an x multiplied by an 8. Put plus signs in between there, and then go down below for our 1. And now if you see the 1, everything you multiply in here is just going to be equal to itself. So a 1 multiplied by an x squared, a 1 multiplied by a 5x, and a 1 multiplied by an 8. So now we're going to multiply these terms through, and x multiplied by an x squared is x cubed. X multiplied by 5x is going to be a 5x squared. X multiplied by 8 is going to be a positive 8x. Then everything here is going to be what's in parentheses. So we have, an x squared plus a 5x plus an 8. And then we just have to go through and combine like terms like we just did previously. So is there any more x cubes? No, I don't see any. So that's going to be by itself. Is there any x squareds? Oh, there's an x squared right there in the middle of that. So what is a 5x squared plus an x squared? Well, that's just going to be a 6x squared. All right, then we're going to have an 8x and a 5x. Well, that's going to be 8 plus 5, or 13x. And then finally, we're going to have our plus 8 at the end.